India is preparing for a world that increasingly resembles the ancient world again. Not in technology, not in weapons, but in the logic of power itself. The age of unquestioned global order is fading. Alliances are becoming fluid. Economic warfare is replacing traditional conflict. Supply chains are becoming strategic weapons. Maritime choke points are once again shaping geopolitics. Information itself has become a battlefield, and across the world, nations are rediscovering an older truth. Survival belongs not merely to the strongest states, but to the most strategically adaptable ones.
Before we move forward, please like, subscribe, and share Strategic Vanguard, and be up to date with the latest news and happenings from the world of defense and strategic affairs. Tune into our video channels in Rumble and YouTube. And if you want to hear the audio version, please tune into Strategic Vanguard Deep Dive in Spotify.
And perhaps no major power understands this transformation more instinctively than India. Because beneath India's modern foreign policy, beneath its Indo-Pacific strategy, beneath its balancing between the United States, Russia, Europe, and the global South, there exists something much older. A deeper strategic memory, a civilizational understanding of power. Long before modern international relations theory emerged, long before Europe constructed the modern state system, ancient Indian thinkers were already studying diplomacy, intelligence networks, alliance systems, economic statecraft, psychological warfare, and geopolitical balancing. At the center of that tradition stood Chanakya, a philosopher-strategist associated with the Arthashastra, one of the most sophisticated manuals of governance and statecraft ever written. But this is not a story about ancient India alone. This is a story about modern India. Because whether consciously or unconsciously, many elements of India's grand strategy today resemble ancient strategic instincts that have survived across centuries. Strategic autonomy, alliance balancing, maritime awareness, economic resilience, long-term patience, civilizational continuity. These are not random policies stitched together by circumstance. They are part of a strategic culture that has evolved over thousands of years. And in an unstable multipolar century, India may once again be rediscovering the strategic logic that once allowed it to emerge as one of the world's great civilizational powers. The global order today is entering a dangerous transition phase. The unipolar era dominated by the United States after the Cold War is weakening. China is rising rapidly and attempting to reshape Asia's strategic architecture. Russia is asserting itself militarily despite economic constraints. Europe remains economically powerful but strategically fragmented. Across the Indo-Pacific, nations are increasingly preparing for prolonged geopolitical competition. This is no longer the era of uncontested globalization. This is the return of geopolitics. And within this changing environment, India occupies a uniquely complex position. India is simultaneously a democratic power, a nuclear state, an emerging industrial giant, a maritime actor, a technological power in transition, and a civilization with thousands of years of strategic memory. India cooperates with the United States while refusing formal alliance dependency. India maintains defense relations with Russia while expanding partnerships with Europe and Japan. India competes strategically with China while still maintaining major economic interactions. India participates in the Quad while also positioning itself as a voice of the global South. To many Western analysts, this appears contradictory. But from the perspective of ancient Indian statecraft, it appears entirely logical. Because ancient Indian strategic thought did not divide the world into simplistic categories of permanent allies and permanent enemies. It viewed geopolitics as fluid, dynamic, and shaped by changing balances of power. This logic was visible in Chanakya's Mandala Theory, which argued that neighboring powers often become natural rivals, while the rival of one's rival may become a strategic partner. Relationships were not governed by ideology alone. They were governed by interests, geography, and survival. Modern India's foreign policy increasingly reflects this same layered realism. India does not seek absolute dependence on any one power bloc. Instead, it seeks room for maneuver. Strategic flexibility, the ability to cooperate without surrendering autonomy. This becomes especially visible in India's relationship with the United States. Over the past decade, India-US strategic cooperation has expanded dramatically. Military exercises, technology partnerships, intelligence cooperation, semiconductor agreements, and Indo-Pacific coordination have all intensified. Yet India still refuses to become a treaty ally. And this frustrates many Western observers who expect alignment to follow traditional Cold War logic. But India's strategic culture has historically viewed excessive dependence as dangerous. Ancient Indian political thinking emphasized preserving sovereign decision-making even while engaging stronger powers. India seeks partnership with the United States, but not subordination. Cooperation, but not strategic absorption. And this instinct is deeply rooted in India's civilizational experience. Modern India often speaks about strategic autonomy as if it were a contemporary doctrine born during the Cold War and the non-aligned movement. But in reality, the instinct itself is much older. Ancient Indian statecraft consistently emphasized the importance of maintaining freedom of action amid competing powers. Because dependence limits strategic options. Autonomy creates leverage, and in a fragmented multipolar world, leverage becomes survival. But ancient Indian statecraft was never based purely on hard realism alone. One of the great misconceptions about Indian strategic thought is that it was either excessively idealistic or purely spiritual. In reality, it combined realism with restraint. Power mattered, security mattered, state survival mattered. But there was also recognition that legitimacy, order, and responsible governance influence long-term stability. This broader framework was often connected to the civilizational idea of Dharma, not merely in a religious sense, but in the sense of maintaining order, balance, obligation, and political legitimacy. A ruler who governed recklessly risked destabilizing the state itself. Power without restraint could generate internal weakness. Strategic ambition without social cohesion could become self-destructive. And this idea still echoes in modern India's global positioning. India rarely presents itself as an expansionist power. Instead, it frames itself as a stabilizing force, a responsible democracy, a civilizational state, and a balancing actor within the international system. This matters because legitimacy itself has become a strategic asset. In the 21st century, wars are fought not only through missiles and armies, but also through narratives, perception, and influence. Nations increasingly compete for moral credibility, diplomatic influence, technological trust, and narrative dominance. Soft power is no longer secondary to hard power. It is part of hard power. And India increasingly understands this relationship. Ancient Indian strategic thought also understood something many modern nations still struggle to comprehend. External strength depends upon internal cohesion. Chanakya devoted enormous attention not merely to warfare, but to governance, taxation, trade, intelligence, agriculture, administration, and infrastructure. Because no state can remain strategically powerful if it becomes internally weak. Economic instability eventually translates into geopolitical weakness. Institutional fragility becomes strategic vulnerability. Internal fragmentation invites external pressure. And modern India's rise increasingly reflects recognition of this principle. Economic growth is no longer viewed merely as development policy. It is strategic capability. Infrastructure is no longer merely domestic modernization. It is geopolitical preparation. Semiconductor manufacturing, AI ecosystems, digital infrastructure, logistics corridors, ports, supply chains, and industrial resilience are now directly connected to national power. This is why India's strategic transformation cannot be understood only through military modernization. It is also about building comprehensive national strength. Civilizations rise through systems, not symbolism. And perhaps nowhere is India's strategic transformation more visible than in the maritime domain. For centuries, India often became excessively continental in its security outlook, focusing primarily on land invasions and border defense. But today, the Indian Ocean is once again becoming central to global geopolitics. Energy routes, trade corridors, submarine deployments, undersea data cables, naval logistics, choke points, carrier operations. The Indian Ocean is becoming one of the defining strategic theaters of the 21st century. Ancient India once maintained extensive maritime trade networks connecting East Africa, the Gulf, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Maritime connectivity was not peripheral to Indian civilization. It was one of its foundations. and modern India is increasingly rediscovering the strategic significance of sea power. This explains the growing emphasis on aircraft carriers, submarine fleets, naval aviation, anti-submarine warfare capabilities, Andaman and Nicobar positioning, Indo-Pacific partnerships, and maritime domain awareness systems. India increasingly understands that future great power competition will not be decided solely along Himalayan borders. It will also be decided across the Indian Ocean. And maritime power historically separates regional powers from true strategic powers. At the same time, India faces perhaps its greatest long-term strategic challenge in the form of China. China's rise is not merely military. It is industrial, technological, financial, demographic, and geopolitical. Beijing seeks to reshape Asia's balance of power while expanding influence across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Yet India's response to China has largely avoided emotional overreaction. Instead, India appears to be pursuing long-term balancing, military modernization, infrastructure expansion, strategic partnerships, maritime counterbalancing, defense industrial growth, technological development, economic diversification. This resembles a form of strategic patience, deeply embedded within older traditions of Indian statecraft. Ancient Indian thinkers understood that major geopolitical contests are rarely resolved quickly. Sustainable competition requires preparation, endurance, and timing. Strategic patience is often mistaken for passivity, but sometimes patience itself is strategy. India appears to recognize that competition with China is not a short-term confrontation. It is a generational contest that will unfold economically, technologically, militarily, and diplomatically over decades. And therefore, India increasingly focuses not merely on immediate reactions, but on long-term capability accumulation. The Arthashastra also placed extraordinary emphasis on intelligence and information networks. Chanakya understood that information itself could determine the survival of states. Today, that insight feels remarkably modern, because the 21st century battlefield increasingly includes cyber warfare, AI-driven propaganda, surveillance systems, narrative manipulation, disinformation campaigns, and digital influence operations. Territory still matters, but perception matters too. Narrative itself has become strategic terrain, and modern India's growing emphasis on cyber capability, digital sovereignty, indigenous technological ecosystems, and information resilience reflects this reality. Because sovereignty in the modern era is no longer merely territorial. It is informational. Perhaps the most profound transformation, however, is psychological. For decades after independence, India often framed itself primarily through post-colonial developmental language. But increasingly, India is beginning to think of itself once again as a civilizational state. Not merely a nation-state born in 1947, but part of a much older historical continuum. This changes how nations behave strategically. Civilizational states often think in longer timelines. They prioritize continuity. They resist external ideological dominance. They view themselves not merely as political entities, but as historical actors carrying accumulated memory across centuries. China increasingly behaves this way. Russia often behaves this way. Turkey increasingly behaves this way. And India is gradually rediscovering aspects of this mindset as well. This does not mean returning to the past, nor does it mean romanticizing history. Ancient wisdom alone cannot solve modern geopolitical realities. Artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, quantum technologies, semiconductor competition, hypersonic weapons, and space warfare require modern capabilities and technological sophistication. No civilization can survive on memory alone. History offers strategic insight, but power still depends on innovation. And this may ultimately become India's defining challenge, adapting ancient strategic instincts to the realities of a technological century. Because the logic of power may endure across history, but the instruments of power constantly evolve. Perhaps this is the deeper significance of India's current transformation. India is not merely rising economically nor merely militarily, it is gradually rediscovering strategic confidence rooted in civilizational continuity. A worldview that combines realism with restraint, power with balance, partnerships with autonomy, patience with preparation. And in an unstable multipolar world, those instincts may become increasingly valuable. Because the 21st century is beginning to resemble a far older geopolitical environment, one defined by fluid alliances, strategic competition, economic rivalry, technological contestation, and balancing behavior among major powers. In such a world, ancient strategic traditions no longer appear irrelevant. They appear unexpectedly modern. Empires may rise and collapse, technologies may transform warfare, weapons may evolve beyond imagination, but certain realities endure across centuries. Geography still matters, economic resilience still matters, internal cohesion still matters, strategic patience still matters. And perhaps this is why ancient Indian statecraft continues to echo within India's modern grand strategy today. The language has changed, the institutions have changed, the technologies have changed. But beneath the surface, some strategic instincts remain remarkably familiar. And in an age of geopolitical uncertainty, India may discover that some of its most modern strategic answers are also among its oldest. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Strategic Vanguard. You can also follow us across platforms. We're on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey, so you never miss our strategic insights. Prefer audio? Tune in on Spotify and Amazon Music, and take Strategic Vanguard with you wherever you go. For deeper, structured analysis, visit strategicvanguard.com/analysis and stay updated with our latest news and views at strategicvanguard.com. Strategic thinking begins with informed perspectives. Stay with Strategic Vanguard.